Good afternoon. My name's James Dean. I'm the Director of Policy and Learning at BBC Media Action. BBC Media Action is the BBC's international development charity. We support media around the world through about 150 partnerships. We reach and engage something like 250 million people. Is that not working? Is that better? Can you hear? Is this working now? Can you hear at the back? A bit closer? Thank you very much. Is that better? Thank you very much for the feedback. We need lots of feedback. I think it's the end of a long day, and we're going to need to keep the energy levels up. And we're missing a participant, but I'll get to that in just a moment. So we're going to try and keep this quite interactive. I'd encourage, if possible, the people at the back to come a bit closer to the front. A, so that we don't have to shout, and B, so that you can be seen and ask questions as we go on. So we're talking about media independence and countering violent extremism. And so I'm just going to give a couple of minutes. Hey, we've got... Sorry, excuse me. How are you? We have a full complement. How about that? So we're talking about media and media independence and countering violent extremism. So just let me spend a couple of minutes talking about why we're talking about this issue. First and most obviously, there has been the success, or at least the apparent success, of narratives, extremist narratives, principally Islamic, but others as well, like white extremists and many others. Both online and offline, in recruiting loyalty and recruiting to violent extremist causes. And that success, or apparent success, has led to significant investment in counter-narratives and counter-messages, some would say, and sometimes counter-propaganda, to combat extremist narratives. That's happening both online and offline. And one of the questions we're going to ask is, are they working? Do those counter-narratives work in the context of really minimizing or mitigating against violent extremism? Do they help underpin, or do they help undermine the independence of the media? Are counter-narratives detracting policy attention and sometimes money away from the support to independent media? So that's one set of questions which I think we'll end up looking at, and one of the reasons we're having this debate. Another one, obviously, is that many governments and authorities are using terrorism and extremism as an excuse to clamp down on the media, to introduce surveillance laws, close down civic space, as Peter Greste said this morning in his comments. So to what extent is that happening? To what extent is it actually having a chilling effect on independent media? And to what extent is it counterproductive, particularly given the growing evidence of links between corruption and violent extremism and radicalization, and the proven ability and capacity of an independent media to hold government and authority to account and to reduce corruption? So in other words, we may be fueling, by the clamping down of the media in the name of deterring violent extremism, we may be fueling the very phenomenon we're trying to be defeated. And of course, there's a more fundamental argument that we keep on coming back to in fora like this, that a free media underpins an informed society, an open and inclusive public debates that reflects different perspectives in society, and that can address fundamentally the drivers of extremism. There's a great deal more understanding of why extremist narratives take hold and are actually effective. Lack of political opportunity, lack of economic opportunity, lack of identity, lack of belonging, lack of status, lack of dignity in society. And a free and open plural media that reflects a diversity of perspectives arguably creates a hostile environment for violent extremism to take hold. It's a slightly unusual panel, and deliberately so, because there have been many discussions about media independence and violent extremism, and by and large we've tended to focus very strongly and heavily on Islamic extremism. And while we will touch on that, we try to get as many different perspectives of this issue from very different types of settings around the world. And as I said, we're going to try and make this as interactive and engaging as possible. So we have on the panel representatives from, we have Sabik Ali, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Netizen Digital Indonesia. It's the official web portal of, I'm going to get the pronunciation of it wrong, I'm sorry, Nahdlatul Ulama. It's the largest Muslim group in Indonesia with 33 million members in Indonesia. And I'm going to just ask Sabik a few questions in a minute. We'll start with him to get a sense of how the situation looks like in Indonesia. Then we'll go on to Ukraine, and Katerina Miasnikova, who's the Executive Director of the Independent Association of Broadcasters in Ukraine, a large network of broadcasters in Ukraine. Then we'll go to West Africa, and we'll talk to Diana Sengor, on my left, who's the Executive Director of the Panos Institute in West Africa, very old friend. And then we'll go to Jake, then we'll go up from the kind of the national to the regional to the international and the global. And we'll go to Jake Luki, who's the Head of Online Safety, Content and Social Impact for the Asia Pacific region in Google. And sorry, I missed out Ricardo Corredor from the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation. And we're going to talk to him about the situation in Colombia. But I want to just start in Indonesia, if you like, if we can, Sabik. We haven't actually had much of a chance to prepare this little bit with Sabik, but could you tell us a little bit about how you see this issue playing out in Indonesia and what your site is doing about it?
Yeah. Good evening. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world, and I think now we are facing the big challenge in Islamic history, because we see that there is a growing tendency on conservatism in Islam. I think since 98 Reformation of Indonesia, there are many new groups, there are many new community growing in Indonesia, in campuses, in the cities, in the villages, that have a conservative tendency on Islam, or maybe ultra-conservative tendency. In Indonesia, we can see there are a lot of groups like FBI, Front Pembela Islam, the Islamic Defender Front, like HTI, Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, also Majlis Mujahidin, and maybe until now they have a big member, but we can see that they are getting stronger every year. If we saw the Jakarta governor election, we can see that there are 100,000 people that follow the narrow perspective of Islam. They all see that the one of the candidates doing a blasphemy on Islam. And I think this is specifically happen in the cities, in the big cities like Jakarta, because if we go around the country, maybe in the East Java or Central Java or maybe Sumatra, we cannot see some kind of group. FBI, HTI, I think they only have a small member in the villages, then in the big cities. And it's because their basis mostly on the middle class from the campuses. They are very strong in online. Yeah. I can show you the chart of Islamic site popularity. Maybe bisa digeser. Lagi. Yeah. This is the picture of Islamic site popularity in Indonesia, and this is a picture of the most highest traffic Islamic site, and most of them are ultra conservative. Number one, Iran Muslims. I give a color. The red is ultra conservative and radical. They are promoting violence and glorifying terrorists like Osama bin Laden. On the side, they often provide an article that glorify Osama bin Laden, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and so forth. And the yellow ones is the conservative ones. Maybe they didn't promote violence or extreme or terrorism, but they have a narrow minded of Islam that maybe have an impact on intolerance.
So can I ask, what's the attraction? And why, to the extent that they're being successful, why are they being successful? Is it the skill of their communication?
Yeah.
Or is it, what are they tapping into that is making it successful?
They're being successful, I think, because they have enough basis on the readers, Muslims, or Muslim urban Muslims. And number two, because they are very active, they have a more well-organized team than the moderate Muslim side. For example, I run a website, NU Online, the official site of NU, the biggest Muslim organization in Indonesia, but we have only have a small team. We have only 7 staff, but we have maybe 100 contributors. But every contributor only write maybe 2 or 3 articles every month. And the radical website, they almost update their website every day, maybe more than 20 articles. So they can reach more reader. They can reach more follower in their website or in their social media.
There's a long history in Indonesia of moderate Islam, and this is a relatively new phenomenon, as I understand it, in Indonesia. So what's the attraction? What is it about their message that is finding such resonance? Why are people listening to this particular brand of Islam, given the long history of Indonesia?
Yeah. There are no single factor on why this is happened. I think the conflict in the Middle East affecting so much on us, yeah? And because of the growing of the newer generation also affecting us so much. For example, the emergence of PKS, Partai Keadilan Sejahtera, I think this is affecting so much, affecting to us. And you mostly the members in the villages. And Muhammadiyah, the second biggest Muslim organization, I think in the campuses, especially in the state campuses like University of Indonesia, like ITB, IPB, I think the young generation of Muhammadiyah is getting weaker in many campuses that for a long time they have a strong basis in that campus.
And do you have a sense in terms of what your website, whether your website is also having any success or attracting that kind? Yours is a moderate website. Who's your target audience? Is it actually those people who are vulnerable to that kind of?
We're trying and we're doing. Yeah, we have been what is necessary, but I think it's not sufficient. We're getting many reader every month, every year. So, for example, on NU, maybe 5 years ago. There is only a small member of NU that can access the internet. So we have only get a small reader on from our members. But since I think 5 years ago, we got many readers and many readers because I think many people that may be aware about what will happen if the radical groups win the mind of the people in Indonesia. So I think I still believe that in Indonesia the moderate Muslim is much more than the radical group. But on the side, on the internet, maybe the radical websites much more active than us.
And just finally, and we'll come back to you later, but do you have a challenge in how to make your content really interesting?
Yeah.
So things, a moderate coverage is inevitably going to be less nuanced, more nuanced. It's going to be more difficult than the shouty, clear, simple message of recruitment. So how do you deal with that issue?
This is one of our challenge. Yeah. If you see the Islamic or radical group or conservative websites, you can find there may be simple content of Islam, like how to do the wudu, how to do a salat. And for us, for most of our new members, this is a common knowledge. So it doesn't need for us to write it again. This is maybe the difference between us and them, because they can get maybe the common people, and the many people from their child, they talk about that, so it doesn't need to write again. And number two, the Islamic side actually, they always creating the provoking article. Maybe some of them not based on the fact. They do not follow the journalist rule. This is the problem. And the people like that controversial article, controversial issues, controversial content. And for us, we have to follow the rules. Based on Islamic values, we have to check the fact, and we have the Islamic side can do that.
Thank you. We'll come back in the questions if that's okay. I'm going to challenge this audience because we are going to be moving around the world a great deal here, and we're going to be moving from issue to issue a great deal here. So I'm actually going to go all the way over to Colombia next, and a completely different form of extremism, and a completely different form of in terms of how this is manifested. Ricardo, just explain a little bit about the Colombian situation and about how you see this whole debate playing out there.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and this chance to share a little bit of this, what's happening in my country. After 52 years of very intense internal armed conflict, the Colombian government and the guerrilla group of the FARC, they signed a peace agreement. It was a negotiation process that lasted for about 5 years, and it was a process that really polarized the country between those who were in favor and those who were against the negotiation. People usually ask me, but why do some people were against a negotiation of a peace process? Of course, this is a very complex answer, but I would say that basically the reason was that this was a guerrilla group that was not really popular in the country, and mainly because they practiced for many, many years kidnapping and narco traffic as a way to sustain themselves financially. So this was not, as you can imagine, well perceived by the general population. Some estimates, said that the FARC had a popularity of about 4 or 5% only. So this was not a guerrilla group that was perceived as representing a big deal of a country. And of course, this is a very long-lasting conflict. So the effects that it had on the country were really heavy. We're talking about more than 200,000 people that were killed, or like 20, depends on who do you ask, but 20 to 30,000 disappeared. And officially, the people that have registered as victims of the conflict now reach about 8 million people. So we're talking about something that has been very intense and widespread around the country, but usually more felt in the countryside than in the urban part of the country. So when President Santos embarked on this idea of a negotiation with this group, this was from the start very controversial, and particularly because ex-President Álvaro Uribe, who ruled for 2 terms before Santos from 2002 to 2010, was completely against it and used all his political power to fight against this idea of a negotiating process with the FARC. So something that that should have been a positive news that we're going to negotiate and ended up a conflict was not perceived very positively for everybody, and there were a lot of people openly against it. And as probably some of you know, the result of this is that when the negotiation was finished, there was a referendum, and in that referendum, the vote against the no actually won for a very thin margin, but the government lost the referendum. So the media played a role here, very and very important. So I want to highlight just a few things about this. In terms of television and the role of television, we have 2 main private networks. And one of the networks actually was very much against the peace process. The other one, I wouldn't say against it, but let's say a little bit more neutral perhaps, but one really openly editorially against the negotiation. An analysis made by the Javeriana University, a very important private university, actually a content analysis of these TV networks showed that the TV coverage was very emotional, with not enough context of what was at stake, and very personalized. I mean, it's based in the political feud between Santos and Uribe. That same study the Javeriana did also analyzed the 2 main newspapers that are based in Bogotá, El Tiempo and El Espectador. And one of the things that shocked me of that research was that 41% of they analyzed almost 11,000 pieces throughout those 4 years of the negotiation process. And 41% of the pieces related to the negotiation were public in the opinion op-ed parts of the newspaper. So we're talking about a coverage that was very opinionated, basically roughly 40% of opinion and 60% of information. So this to me is interesting because, of course, when you talk about opinion, the opinion and in those cases in particular was really radical. Usually against or in favor, and nothing in between. But the other thing that was interesting is that there was another study, and this was analyzing social media, in particular Twitter. That was made by Clemencia Rodriguez, which is a Colombian at the Oklahoma University, and some other colleagues. And basically they took Uribe and Santos' Twitter accounts, and they went analyze it. And the results are also, I believe, they have something to say about it. And the first of all is that Uribe's Twitter, it's overwhelmingly intensified the polarization and promote the rejection of the peace process. He was really really against it. Of all the tweets, there was like 31.5% that presented the peace process in a very negative way, in terms of exaggerated narratives and hyperboles and reference to the process in terms of winners and losers and interpretation of the government's concessions as a defeat, these kinds of things. Uribe is very active in Twitter. As a matter of fact, he, for instance, we're talking about, in this analysis, he tweeted about 200 times a week. So we're talking about like 28 tweets a day. And he was really, and today he has 4,700,000 followers. Santos, the president, has roughly the same amount. But Uribe really went in this very radical position against the peace process, and with him, all his followers. The other thing that I thought was interesting in this analysis is that, in this case, you will imagine that there is a lot of people that would start studying the role of media. And I must say that I was surprisingly shocked that there wasn't, really. I mean, what I found out is this Javeriana University study, this study by Clemencia, and not really many others. So we're talking about a process where we didn't really study this in depth. Not much analysis on this, which is really strange because it's not that complicated to do content analysis and these kinds of things. But so we don't have much information besides what I'm sharing here in my personal opinion.
So ultimately, Ricardo, who are the extremists here? Who are the extremists in this setting?
I mean, I certainly think that Uribe really went for it in a very radical way. I mean, this is a political feud. And so he really went after it. And Santos used his Twitter account too, but as president, he was more moderate. Of course, he was trying to defend the peace process, but he had to be more controlled. Uribe didn't have any control at all. He was a very popular president. He had this almost 5 million followers, and he really went for it. I mean, he really went all the way in a very radical way.
I suspect underpinning a lot of this conversation will be the dilemma, the pull between the clear, more extreme voice and the moderate one, and actually who is actually going to be winning out here. So the idea that a lot of people in this conference center are all about supporting free and independent media as a way of underpinning a public debate where different sides are heard in the public realm, and that creates an environment where where extremism and ultimately violent extremism is less likely to take hold. You seem to be suggesting that's not necessarily the case. The balanced debate is not winning out here.
And I also think that the media didn't really play that role in a more moderate way. They also went radical. RCN, which was one of the networks.
For political reasons or economic reasons or their own agendas, or what was?
Yeah, I mean, we are not talking about fully independent private networks. The two main networks belong to the two main big economic groups of the country. But I would say it's more political in the sense of, as I said, a very long-lasting conflict that affected for many, many years. And a lot of people were really revolted that there was an idea of negotiating with this group that something they didn't deserve this negotiation.
So just finally, before we move on just for now, is to tell us a bit about the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation and that kind of a vision of the journalism that underpins your foundation, and whether you think that vision is really, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic of a kind of journalism that you represent is actually ultimately going to win through in Colombia.
Well, I mean, many people don't know that Garcia Marquez was also a journalist at heart. Mainly people know him because of his literary work. But he was a journalist at heart. He practiced journalism for many, many years, even until he was until he got sick. And he founded media houses throughout his life, and he always had a dream of having a newspaper. So he was a journalist at heart, and the idea when he created the foundation was that he really believed, we're based in Colombia, and but we worked in all Latin America, but he really believed that the role of journalism in democracy, and that the role of journalism was to do what journalism is to do, tell stories, well told stories, well investigated, with ethical standards. So what we have been doing is a lot of journalism training, and in the case of in Colombia in particular, because we are in Colombia and because we are Colombians working there, we had a series of workshops during those 3 first years of the negotiation process in trying to provide journalists with tools so they can cover the process in a more controlled manner. But of course, we're talking about the journalists themselves, that when they come to their media houses and they are involved in radical editorial policies, their personal position or their ideas get not necessarily are heard, So I have to say that I might have to be a little bit skeptical of, the idea of a more balanced coverage of a process with more context, with more analysis.
You're skeptical because you don't think it'll happen, you're skeptical you don't think it'll work?
Well, skeptical because, we tried the best we could in working with journalists all over the country in trying to, how to cover this in a more calm manner. But we realized that the political polarization was so strong that even the journalists that were trying to do a more sensible coverage was difficult for them, because they were really in the midst of this political feud, and it was very difficult for them to stay away from it.
Okay, I think we'll come back to that issue. I'm going to come to Diana next, if that's all right, and West Africa. So, very different setting again. I'm sorry, we're going to spin around the world quite a lot here. But Diana, just tell us a little bit about how you see this manifesting itself in West Africa.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this debate, to you and to the BBC Action. West Africa, and particularly the Sahelian countries, which are in the northern part of West Africa, at the border of the Sahara, are the countries the most affected by terrorist groups during these last years. Last year, 257 attacks. This phenomenon...
On journalists. 257 attacks on...
In 1 year. This phenomenon is increasing. It was in last year 150% more than the previous year. It's expanding geographically, so it started in 2003 in Nigeria with Boko Haram. In 2013, 3 countries were concerned. Actually, there are 5 countries which have been victims of attacks, and 8 countries in total are under threats of attacks. For instance, last week, a group of terrorists was arrested in Senegal. This phenomenon is also converging between the northern groups, so ACMI, which is related to Al-Qaeda, and another group, which is Mujiao, and they have formed an alliance. It was 2 months ago. So the alliance for the Islamic State in the Great Sahara. And then the connection is to be established between the northern groups and the southern groups, between this group and Boko Haram. This is only the visible part of the iceberg. Because what is growing now is not mainly the violent extremism, but the religious extremism which has violent effects. The religious extremism is growing in the private behaviors, in the private sphere, but mainly it is growing in the institutions with a strong and weight, and stronger weight of the religious lobby. For instance, some years ago, the government in Mali tried to pass a law to the parliament in order to have the right of women within the family and generally the civic rights more protected. There was a big reaction from the Islamist groups, and finally the parliament decided not to pass the law. The same phenomenon some years after in Niger about a law forbidding the marriage of girls before 18. And last week in Mali, the Minister of Justice committed himself to have a law passed against the female circumcision before the end of the year. Reaction of the Islamist group, you will see if you will be able to pass this law. So the institutions, but perhaps more importantly, because the media have a direct effect on them, the opinions. So there are not so many studies about the opinion on the religious extremism. But there is one published last year in October in Senegal, run by the Timbuktu Institute. It was a sample of 300 people between 18 and 35 years old, so young people in the suburbs of Dakar, 10 localities in the suburbs of Dakar. Among them, 8% of the population, or the sample, declared that they were prepared to enter in a group defending a radical Islam. If you see what 88% means on this sample, when you know that the suburbs, the population in these suburbs, the population of this age is about 500,000, that makes 5,000 candidates to the jihadism, only in the suburbs of Dakar. Now, there are only 8%. But when the sample, the people in the sample were asked what they were thinking about the attacks in Paris, 90% said that the attacks in Paris were legitimate because the Prophet had been insulted. So, the question is, the problem is to combat violent extremism or to combat the religious extremism leading to violence. The media now, is really my second point. What are the role of the media in front of this growing extremism? And which media? Perhaps the situation will not, in Sahel, will not answer the question how it is put in the global debate. Because there is no evidence, for instance, that the social media are primarily or constructing the opinion or inciting to jihadists. Why? Because a good part of the candidates to the jihad are coming from marginalized territories or regions within the country: North Mali, North Nigeria, North Niger, North Cameroon, Southeast Niger, and these regions are very poorly connected. Most of the young people there are illiterate. So, what is the use of the internet there? Another part of the candidates to the jihad are living in the suburbs. So, in the sample that I was evocating, 90% of the sample have been at school. And in Dakar, the connections are very good. But in the sample, when the young people were asked, where are the sources of going to the jihad? How will you be incited to go to the jihad? Only 3% said it would be, or for the other, it has been through the internet. So we need to be more balanced. So it seems that currently the traditional media are much more influenced than the new media and the social media. So
just to clarify, they're more influential in shaping loyalty and opinion, or they're more. So, are you suggesting that they are involved in the recruitment or the radicalization?
I meant that the traditional media are much more reaching the people than the social media. So the traditional media should be considered as the main vehicle for any discourse, or pro-jihad or against the jihad. But we must recognize that the media are not playing their role, the traditional media are not playing their role at all. Let's see the media outlets. They are more and more numerous to be religious media. They are presenting themselves as religious media. In a legal way, in some countries, for instance Mali, religious media are permitted. In other countries like Senegal, like Niger, like Nigeria, even Nigeria, religious media are not permitted. But, in fact, they are funded by religious associations themselves, funded by generally Turkey, Gulf countries, funding this association. So the media outlets, religious media outlets, are invading. In Mali, we have five radio stations only in Bamako. When I say they are illegal, 43 have been created without any permission, and most of them have been created by religious leaders, and some of them are very influential. One of them has a membership of 1 million persons. So the regulatory body in Mali, it was 1 month ago, said we shall close down this TV and radio station. And the two of the big religious leaders said, come, we'll see, come. Media content is also a problem. Because more and more, in the TV or in the radio stations, the volume of program devoted to religious program is increasing. So, depending on the hours, late in the night, a lot. In some periods, for instance, during the Ramadan, but it's increasing and it's invading too. The format, so we can come back on the format, but There are three religious songs, recitation of the Quran, and preachers. How the preachers are produced, that would be interesting to see. And the role of the journalist. The journalist, in general, seems to have deserted this battlefield. They are the editors, so there are many connections between the editors and the religious leaders. The journalists, some of them are saying, before being journalists, we are Taliban. So, and the media umbrella organization or the self-regulatory body have not been very, not been at the front of this battle. For instance, in Mali, the Association of Radio Broadcasters is supporting one of the religious leaders, saying that we shall not close down our radio and our TV.
So what do you think should be the regulatory response to this?
So I was speaking of the self-regulatory body, because in these countries we must recognize that the regulatory bodies have been generally rather courageous. In Niger, the regulatory body, for instance, closed down one TV because the TV, which was an Islamist TV, has criticized and wanted to forbid secular TV, which was celebrating Christmas. So, in Senegal, we have also good example, but they are at stake. They are at stake because they don't have the support of the general opinion, and they have very weak support from the authorities. So the last point, and probably it is just a question that we could discuss after, but where are the voices of change? Where are the voices of resistance? And there are some in the media, but most of them, from what I know, from what I experience, are rather in other sectors than the civil society organization, the artists, the social movements. Yeah.
So can I just, I want to move on to Katrina, but can I just ask one question here, which is, again, this question of why are things going in this direction? Is this because of demand from people, where there is a ready-made audience who want to hear this? I'm not sure how much of it's religious broadcasting and how much of it's extremist broadcasting. I think we have to make a distinction there. But anyway, is there there's a ready-made audience and it's responding to that audience? Or how much of it is an organized recruitment drive, not just by the sound of things from IS or Al-Qaeda, but from a whole multiplicity of different actors?
Indeed, there is a demand, a strong demand, because and growing demand. Because at the very beginning, before the 90s, the period where the media were liberalized, so the religious discourse was strictly regulated, both in terms of quantity in the public, monopolistic media, but a strong regulation, with journalists intervening in the religious debates. When after the community radio, private radio, and then TV were created, so they understood that there was a strong demand. So, and they have been competing in creating this space within their media for religious discourse. So it's an effect, an ironical effect of the liberalization.
But
and then it is not regulated anymore, nor by the editors, nor by the
But it does sound a little like the demand for what I know Panos has been doing for many years, is supporting a plural information landscape characterized by good journalism. The public demand for that kind of landscape and that kind of journalism doesn't seem to be particularly strong. Is that right?
It's balanced because in a way you have a demand for religious programs, but the same people, when asked, said, and it's quite equivalent. We are also looking or hearing programs which are about information or which are about entertainment. But entertainment plus religion is much more important than information.
Okay.
So an issue will be how because the public is shared, because there is a demand for entertainment and a demand for the religious discourse. So how shall we play that?
This is complicated stuff.
Very good.
Let's move on to Ukraine. Thank you, Diana. Katrina, just to give us a sense from your perspective of how this just adds complexity. Jake's going to sort it all out. Sorry, Jake's going to sort it all out for us at the end. But I imagine you're going to add yet another layer of complexity to this.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you, James. So yeah, when I was invited to this panel, I was really thinking, really Ukraine in this panel, and then I realized it's, in fact, yes. Since 2014, we having anti-terroristic campaign in our country, in the east of the country. Since military groups, so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People Republic, have occupied part of our eastern territories with support of Russian Federation, and since there we have in Ukraine saying that we can call it an extremism because these groups. Already for more than 2 years, not only control and don't give possibility Ukraine to control their territory, but also they recruit people in Ukraine and Russia. The militaries and become a part of this group. They kidnap people. We have more than 10,000 people killed during the conflict, including the civilians. And all this, unfortunately, make Ukraine convenient to this panel. Yeah, and what I can of course speak a lot about media role in this issue because. Those who mainly part of these groups, these young men who don't have much education, they have very specific view on the post-Soviet, our post-Soviet and post-Soviet history. They really have they are taking by myth that if Soviet times will come back, their life will be better and more happier, and they're ready to fight for this. And I can say that's also the problem of Ukraine, the lack of education, lack of good communication, and of course what we see now and how they're working. So what the main trend that this territory people not really trust to any traditional media, television or radio. All terrestrial media in this territory are taken by these groups and partly by Russian channels. The population there watching both Russian and Ukrainian television, but the level of trust to this channels are very low. From Ukrainian side, it's mostly because of the very different narrative that provided by. We have 32 national channels, many of them owned by big businessmen. We call them oligarchs, and each channel provide different narratives. So. People there are not able to see the very concrete and specific picture of Ukraine. It's very different from channel to channel. And
you mean in terms of a kind of national identity? Or
and about reforms, changes, and so the. On the other hand, these channels that controlled by these groups and Russian channels doing their best to provide as negative picture of Ukraine as possible. So people confused. And if in the beginning of the conflict we saw the quite a big level of trust to Russian channels and low level of trust to Ukrainian channels. Now all traditional media a very small level of trust, but they work through social networks. Mostly it's two local networks like Одноклассники and Vkontakte. Vkontakte a little bit like a Facebook, and I can say that is Facebook like. There is a different kind of groups there to like discuss possibilities that give to young people participation in different in these groups. So this is like, and Ukraine in fact facing a lot of challenges in providing like convenient information to the, especially to those who live inside of occupied zones. But what I really want to speak about in this panel, it's problem of facing in internet freedoms, because caused by the conflict, by the big demand from the society to react on that situation, our government start to build regulation, especially in internet side, that in fact, from my point of view, really dangerous and can be like a way to censorship, because just recently in the January 2016, there was evaluation provided by the Internews Ukraine. It's called Internet Freedom During the Armed Conflict, and the main experts said the experts mainly said that the main danger for internet freedoms now blocking of contact, pressure on internet providers, and legal initiatives in the sphere of internet freedoms. So because we don't have enough capacity to provide enough good quality information, and to transport this information inside of this, especially in the occupied zones. We see how, like, our government trying to protect population from the such sources of information. We have since 2014 we have Ministry on Information Policy, something not very good from my also point of view to have. But this March, the Minister of Information Policy announced that Ministry is going to have the list of websites. Now I'm reading that undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. So this list will be agreed with Ukrainian Security Service, and it's something that really now in the focus of media developers and freedom speech protectors, because it's still not happened, and we still have a big negotiation with ministry about the need of such list. But this trend really something we need to be more.
And just quickly, just to be clear about the justification being used by the government to introduce this measure. What are they saying?
They're saying that we have our doctrine on informational security, and they say because, like, according to our legislation, different kind of activities support terrorism, especially these terroristic groups, are forbidden. That gives them possibility to block these websites, but it's very tiny border between this and real censorship. That's why in Ukraine many organizations who work with internet freedoms, like Internet Association, we support them, the Turkish media. We have a big society of media developers, like now have a very tough negotiations with ministry and security service about such initiatives. So this is, for me, is in Ukraine, the main issue of influence situation that can influence not only this part of the country but whole country.
Okay, thanks very much, Katrina. So I'm going to come to Google, full of very smart people, and Jake's going to sort it all out for us. But Jake, just to sort of, I just want to find out a bit about how you're thinking about this and where you're going on it. But I think if a conversation we've had so far shows anything, is clearly, but it is a highly complex set of issues at work here, manifest in very different ways. Originally, there was a sort of encouragement to call this panel and restrict it to the online. But I think some of the things, we commissioned a piece of research or supported a piece of research about 18 months ago from something called the UK Partnership for Conflict, Crime and Security. And that did a review of the evidence about what media and communication strategies were working in the context of countering violent extremism. And what that suggested is that the evidence supporting the fact that the violent extremist communication in the first place is actually recruiting loyalty is somewhat nuanced. It's not completely conclusive. And certainly that the evidence supporting a counter-narrative approach is also not terribly strong in terms of whether that's effective or not. And that the key reason for that, the research suggested, was that the reason why, to the extent that the narratives from extremist organizations are working, wherever they may come from, are working, is because they lock into a lot of what I think we've heard on the panel, is these feelings of identity, lack of belonging, lack of opportunity, lack of lack of status, dignity, and so on and so forth. But the counter-narratives or the response finds it much more difficult to lock into those sense of grievance, if you like, or sense of lack of, they can't offer the same level of dignity or belonging that perhaps some of the violent extremism narratives do. And that works whether it's online or offline, regardless of where things are. But anyway, just give us a sense from what Google's up to and how you're thinking about this.
Sure, thank you, James. Yeah, much of what you said resonates with the way that we think about these issues. I think that we're in a situation now where there's been so much attention focused on radicalization, extremism, terrorism online, that it's being used now as a justification for much greater calls for censorship and for sort of an environment that doesn't value free speech. At Google, we start from a perspective of supporting free speech. It's a core value of YouTube, and it really underlies a lot of the ways that we think about these issues. But at the same time, we do have another core value at YouTube, which is freedom to belong. And so we do think that, in the online space, we do need to preserve an environment where people can feel safe and feel that they also have a place there as well. And so those two core values can sometimes be in tension with one another, right? Because on the one hand, we want people to be able to have an environment where they can say what they want and express themselves, but at the same time not do it in a way that makes other people feel like they're going to become victims of violence, or they're going to be discriminated against, etc. So these core values and the tension there really is at the core of a lot of the challenging cases that we face in dealing with these issues. But at the same time, most of the research that we have seen supports what you said as well, which is that people are not radicalized primarily online, right? It starts in the offline world, and a lot of the factors that contribute to radicalization start in the offline world. And so to the extent that the online world does contribute, it's usually more of continuing them down that path rather than putting them on that path. And at the same time, when we think about how to counter that, counter-narratives also need to link the online and the offline world. And this feeling of not belonging, of not having a community, of not having a voice. At Google and the work that we're doing in this space, we're really thinking about how can we link online counter-narratives with groups that are working on the ground in physical space to help people who are at risk to find that sense of community, both online and offline. So some of the things that we think about here in terms of counter-narratives is also the voice that is filtered through, right? So we're doing a lot of work now. We have a program called YouTube Creators for Change, and it's operating in 9 countries around the world right now, and we have 11 ambassadors. And these ambassadors are people who are sort of YouTube creators who have a wide audience, And many of them actually come from communities that are at risk of radicalization themselves, or are working in those communities themselves. And they're trying to address some of these issues of the insider-outsider, but also some of the issues around making things fun and engaging, which we heard earlier, right? How do you make counter-narratives feel like that they're fresh, they're engaging, they appeal to the audience they're targeted at? And so for an example of this collaboration between the online and offline space, in Indonesia, we have one ambassador. It's called Cameo Project, and they're a group who produces sort of fun, sometimes humorous, engaging content on social issues. And they're partnering with Marif Institute, which is a local NGO think tank who works in schools with students who are at risk of extremism. And so Cameo Project is actually going into those schools, working with Marif around thinking about what are the values that really underlie Indonesia, you know, at its founding, around pluralism, diversity. Though it's a majority Muslim country, we, you know, that the founding fathers of Indonesia really believed that this should be a country where other religions were welcomed and tolerated. And through that, then helping to spur conversations with those students and get ideas for video content that Cameo can make, as well as the students themselves can make, and then push out through their own community. So it actually reaches the groups that these students are engaging with themselves. So it reaches the right audiences. So that's one way we're thinking about this linkage that you mentioned. So this investment in counter-narratives is really a core part of the way we think about the issues at Google. But I also do want to highlight another dimension, which is that we do also have policies in place on YouTube to make sure that YouTube is not a platform that promotes hate and violence. So we don't allow content that incites violence or terrorism. We don't allow hate speech. And so we rely on our community of users to flag that content for us. And then we have reviewers reviewing it 24 hours a day. 98% of our flags are reviewed within 24 hours. And so then we try to make sure that we can take that content down as quickly as possible. So that although we have a general presumption of free speech, we do have certain guidelines to make sure that we have a safe and secure environment for our users. So that kind of gives you a little bit of the two different ways we approach both in the safe space, but also then promoting more positive counter-narratives to get at the underlying ideas that we're concerned about.
I've got about 15 questions, but I think I'd better open it up, otherwise I'll get lynched by the audience. Yes, please. And is there a microphone going round? Otherwise maybe I'll do it actually. I wanted to walk around.
Okay.
I'm going to walk around. We need to liven this up. It's the end of the day, and I'm very jet-lagged, and I imagine a lot of other people are, so we'll do this quite mobile.
Yes, hi, my name is Nick. I'm here, I guess, representing United Nations Information Center, but more for myself. I had a question perhaps for Jake as a representative of Google. We see a lot, sitting here and listening to these various talks about what journalism, what media can do about tackling violent extremism and perhaps terrorism internationally. I feel that at some point there's a narrative that suggests that with the advent of new technology, that information is far more accessible. People have a lot more closer ties to express themselves and report on issues and matters. Yet at the same time, it also is an enabler for extremism, new ways in which terrorism, but not only just terrorism, but other kinds of violent forms of opinions or actions can be propagated in certain communities or internationally or nationally, right? So I feel that there is, and not to discredit moves that Google, for instance, is making, or other large tech companies, to look internally and revise their approaches to their online platforms. But I feel that there isn't enough political culpability given or targeted against large tech companies, given that they have so much authority, so much money and influence concentrated in the very few websites that we use in our daily lives. And what can we really, why isn't there more of a critical lens focused on these big technology companies?
Hold on to that thought, Jake. We'll just take a few more, okay? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Yanita. I'm from Leiden University, the Netherlands. Actually, in case of counterterrorism, I would like to know, does it make any difference between countering hate speech in online media and traditional media, or even in general, like offline in general? And how does it differ? And I mean, technically, how does it should be addressed to the audience? Thank you.
Okay. Think about who wants to answer that. Let's take 2 more.
Okay, thank you. I'm Misako from UNESCO. So I heard a lot of, example how the media has contributed to increase the existing polarization. A lot of bad example of the media. The ironic effect of liberalization, as you told, and also, bad example from the government, how they try to censor some website to prevent violent extremism. But as, the Jake from Google pointed out, people do not radicalize online, but they start online. And I was wondering if you have any example of a good collaboration between the media and government, the government creating the structure for the young people to develop the feeling of belonging to a certain community, structure for education, for better employment opportunities, and having a strong collaboration with the media to disseminate the message. I don't know if you have such example in your country.
Okay, we've got 2 for Jake, and I'm just going to come here as well. And one is the question, just remind us about online and offline, and see who wants to answer that. But just one more question here.
Thank you. I'm Soraya from University of Al-Azhar, Indonesia. I'm really concerned about the issue of the counter-radical narrative, especially in the new media. I saw that so many persons, they come from the intellectual person, they make the polarization more sharp. Because they're using their ability to create a public opinion in social media especially, and it made digital divided between the unintellectual person or unliterate person, and they create, because they have more access, ICT access, more intellectual, more knowledge. And what do you think about that? Because I think if you want to attack the hate crime and the terrorism or the radical narrative, we have to start from the intellectual person. Because I think the intellectual person play a very meaningful position to create the public opinion. Especially in Indonesia, I saw so many persons come from the educated people, they make the polarization more I mean sharper compared with the offline. So in online media, they make it very crowded, they make it very getting worse because of their speech or opinion. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Just to be clear about, so do you think the focus should be on the online or the offline? You think it's about the online, but we need to focus most. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, if you are talking about the extremism and radical narrative terrorism, if you have to focus, there is some people who create themselves as opinion leader, and they are using online media especially to create the kind of opinion. I want to share that this is not done by the religious person only, but it's also by social leader or social media leader, and they making or getting worse because of their opinion. They make the polarization wider from before.
Thank you. Jake, can you start us off on answering any of those that you feel are most sensible?
Sure. Well, the first one was obviously directed here, so I can start with that one. No, I totally appreciate that. I appreciate the question, and I know that this is something that is on the minds of many people. So just to give a bit of background, one thing is that we do at Google, and in particular YouTube, I can focus a bit there because that's where a lot of the focus, I think, around these kind of questions is. We do take a lot of responsibility for these issues, and we do have, as I mentioned, people who are reviewing user flags 24 hours a day. But to give you just a sense of the volume of content that we're dealing with here, we have over 400 hours of content uploaded on YouTube every minute. In 2015, we did get over 250,000 flags a day. We removed over 90 million videos. So we do spend a lot of time. We have thousands of people and invest hundreds of millions of dollars into making sure that YouTube, is a safe space for people. But at the same time, we do view YouTube as a platform that's connecting creators with users who want to access that information. So it isn't a place where we're going around and proactively monitoring, trying to say who should be able to say what. Free speech is a core value. So even though we do have these guidelines in place, we do depend on our users to flag those things for us, and then to make sure that they also take a role in making that community safe itself. And we don't want to be in a position where we're proactively monitoring content that's posted there. We don't view that as our role. So. But I do definitely understand this is a difficult issue, but I want you to know we take it very seriously, and we're constantly improving our processes to make it as good as we can.
Okay. Does anyone else want to? Do you want to reflect on some of this?
Okay, maybe is there any difference between maybe an online campaign and an offline campaign? I think so that very. There is a big difference between offline and online, because in the offline, people need to know who you are. You have maybe you need to have authority on, for example, on the issues. For example, if you talk about the Islam, the people will see is you have authority on Islamic knowledge or not. But in online, you don't need that. In online, everybody can write about everything, even in Islamic side. In the Quran, there are 1,000 verses in a Quran. In online, for example, maybe one student can write about issues on Islam, and they can quote one or two verses. And maybe people will agree with you because they don't know about another verse. This is different. In online, I think many people that have no authority on Islamic knowledge, but they always campaigning about Islamic values based on their narrow understandings, and that's happened in Indonesia. Maybe the most popular ustad in Indonesia, not the most knowledgeable ulama. Yeah, for example, Arifin Ilham in Indonesia, or maybe Ustad. Yeah, there are many Ustad in Indonesia, and they become popular because of the TV, because they regularly appear on the TV, not because of their knowledge about Islam, because they regularly appear on the TV. In Indonesia, there are many ulama, the intellectual Islam that have a deep knowledge on Islam, but they never appear on the TV.
So
they never write an article in the website. That's also our problem. In the NU, there are many ulama from Al-Azhar University, from UIN, from Qura, Saudi Arabia, but they don't have a tradition on writing article.
But given this is a conference on press freedom or media freedom more broadly, what's your solution to that?
Yeah, what we are doing is one is encouraging people, encouraging the young ulama in our networks to regularly creating the article and video typing their pengajian, video typing their teaching. Because, for example, if you check on the YouTube, mostly in YouTube, I think the conservative Muslim who provide the Islamic teaching like Zakir Naik or in Indonesia Khalid Basalamah. They don't follow the moderate Islam, but they follow the Wahhabism. But they are very active. They provide 1,000 video tape. And in NU, the most moderate ulama, they don't. They only have a small video. We're creating that. We're starting to create more contents on article or video. We're also developing some different platform, and we're organizing. We're encouraging people to aware that this is important for the next Indonesia. That if you all the ulama, the old ulama or the young ulama, if you never write your minds, your perspective, the moderate perspective of Islam, so the fool will hijack the Islam.
Thank you. Very, very good. Just very quickly, I'm going to come to Katrina. We are going to finish by 10:02. Okay, so don't drift off.
Okay.
And we've got an important announcement from Unesco as well.
Yeah, I will be very brief. So I think that online you can be very niche. You can be niche, as much niche as you need to hit audience you need to. When you go offline, you anyway territorial, national, regional, and you speak to big audience. So in Ukraine we have a situation when a group of national channels, not like providing any like radical messages, but they creating a good atmosphere for this. Like they providing negative information about the situation in Ukraine. They help to hit this, especially young men that don't have jobs, don't have possibilities. The special group here is IDPs, those who moved and not able to find any solution for their life and they live in a new city or in new homes. So an answer here, like, sorry, I will be very a good journalist. So to give them other sources, high quality information on that level. And for example, in Ukraine, we're trying to build a system of public television as a provider of good quality news and information, because among the 30 TV channels that providing different narratives from different businessmen, we still need a good quality and one source of good quality information. And your question about the example, we have vice versa. We have a project for IDPs that support dialogue with different groups of IDPs that's now highly supported by Minister of Occupied Territories and IDPs. So it's really help them, give them possibility to find success stories and to learn from each other about the solution to their problems in the situation.
I'm being told I need to wind up very soon, but can I just ask Ricardo, can you tell the story about what Gabriel Garcia Marquez was going to call his newspaper?
Oh, yeah, well, Garcia Marquez had this project. He dreamed of having a newspaper, and he was very close to have one. And I was telling James that it struck me when we found out about this recently. The name that he chose for the newspaper was The Other, El Otro in Spanish. So it is this idea coming to where Kathy was saying of the importance of quality journalism. I think in this discussion, to have quality journalism, but also to have, I think it is important that we can monitor media. I think this is something that has not been discussed a lot, but organizations that do this monitoring of the media. Because when you create these possibilities, when you can interact with the media around these kind of like simple things like content analysis, that brings the discussion to another level. We did, for instance, during the conflict, it was very difficult to discuss with media about the coverage because it's always a discussion of perceptions. We think you covered wrong, no, I think I covered right, and it's like you go back and forth. So in the end, we did this simple content analysis, and for instance, we found out that 50% of the information had only one source of information, which is like basic journalism, you know. So when we talk about this with the news directors, the newspapers, the discussion went elsewhere. It was not, we're doing it right or wrong. No, there's 50% of the information that only has one source. Why is this happening? And then we try to get, but we unfortunately didn't follow that more thoroughly. But if we could have done something more regularly in terms of monitoring and discussing this with the media, perhaps we would have improved this coverage. So I really believe that the monitoring and organizations, civil society organizations that do monitoring, civil society organizations, not the government, doing monitoring, I think they will be helpful in this context.
So let me just try and, I'm not going to be able to completely sum this up, but just let me sum it up a little bit in terms of a conversation. What I think we've heard is multiple crises. There is a crisis or a phenomenon of extremist content, both online and offline. that perhaps is being more successful than it otherwise would, because there's also a crisis in journalism, both the market for journalism and the supply of journalism. And there's also a crisis of the public space. And I'm really struck by what Ricardo says Gabriel Garcia Marquez was going to call his newspaper The Other, because I think there is a fundamental challenge, which is actually, where is the market solution? Where is the place in the 21st century democratic discourse where people actually encounter each other and engage with each other and actually understand the perspectives of the other, religious, political, factional, ethnic, or whatever. And I think there is something going on here which goes way beyond the production of extremist content, which speaks fundamentally to the way in which human society is communicating to itself, where these fundamental issues of identity and belonging, of being left out by an economic system, a political system, is exacerbated by a media and communication system, but actually isn't actually providing the mechanism through which people can engage with each other. I'm not even going to, that's a hugely contested point to end with, which can be disagreed with, and we're actually out of time. So sorry, Jake, I should let you have an answer to that, but I'm not going to. There's lots of places you can go to for an answer to that. I haven't said very much for myself during this debate. Can we just stay in the room? Just a 2-minute announcement from UNESCO, because actually we are announcing the launch of 2 materials. So there's a microphone here, which I think is on.
So thank you. So this is, I'm pleased to present you today a new handbook for journalists that UNESCO has just released also today, which is called Terrorism and the Media, that I hope will bring some answers to the question that were raised in that session. So this publication, it provides some practical advice, guidance to the journalists who are covering incidents related to terrorism, and in order to have terrorism coverage which is professional, which is free of stigmatization, and which is not sensationalist. And in developing that publication, there are 3 key principles that UNESCO tried to mainstream in that publication on the issues that, in a way, we tackled the terrorism reporting. One of the principles is that we have to protect independent journalism, because UNESCO believes that freedom of expression and independent journalism are key factors to reduce the appeal for radicalization. So any measures, as it was already mentioned, to prevent violent extremism should be necessary, proportionate, and not to violate freedom of expression. The second principle that underpins that publication is that UNESCO promote media and information literacy as a response to that. We have to empower the users of the media to critically assess the content of the media and in shaping their own identities instead of being exploited to develop identities by the others. And the third principle and UNESCO's position is that we promote conflict-sensitive reporting. We subscribe to the view that journalists should seek to avoid being the heating business and should be more the cooling business. And journalists should be aware of the pitfall of reinforcing fear and emotion, which can be exploited by different groups, including the government. So this publication is available at UNESCO's booth upstairs, but also you can download it online. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've just got one, sorry, I have a complaint from Diana because I didn't let her answer one of her questions. So we'll just have 30 seconds from Diana on.
Yes, just because I don't want to leave you on this Afro-pessimistic impression. In fact, we have really hope of change. Both in the media, so there are wonderful young journalists who are changing the thing, and sometimes from an Islamic point of view. There are also all these human rights organizations which are more and more using the social media, and Panos is really supporting such a process. The same for the artists. They are changing things. Now, finally, I think that the influencers also are creating links with all the other actors of change, be there in the traditional media or be there in the social media. So that the next battle will be indeed on the social media, not exclusively, but more and more on the social media. And I think that the civil society organizations are strengthened, and we should go further in strengthening such a movement.
Thank you, Diana, very much. Can I thank the Global Forum for Media Development, who has co-sponsored this panel with BBC Media Action. On the panel, Ricardo is actually the chair of the Global Forum for Media Development, which is the umbrella organization and media support organizations. Diana and Katrina, and also myself, are on the steering committee of that. So thanks to GFMD for co-sponsoring this. The BBC Media Action website's actually got quite a lot of material relevant to this, not least in terms of something we're trying to do, which is actually to try and re-galvanize the debate about public service broadcasting and the role of national public service media in providing that platform for a debate that can engage all in society and connect all in society. It's a view that we've come back to, inevitably having our origins in the BBC is something that's fundamental to our DNA, but it's something that we feel has become increasingly, these issues of identity, belonging and so on, have become increasingly relevant to the whole debate on public service broadcasting. And so we have various publications on our website, bbcmediaaction.org, which make some of the arguments around this. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you very much to you.